Дорогие зрители, меня зовут Юля, я продюсер программы Института Стрелка. Спасибо всем, кто смотрит нас на YouTube, в Фейсбуке, ВКонтакте и собирается провести с нами ближайший час. Я бы хотела представить сегодняшнего спикера публичной программы «Стрелка 2020 Live» Дэвида Гарсию, архитектора, исследователя, профессора и директора магистерской программы «Архитектура и экстремальная среда» Датской Королевской академии изящных искусств. Профессор Гарсия в своей лекции расскажет об инструментах реагирования на катаклизмы и о том, как может измениться архитектура после карантина. После лекции будет небольшая серия Q&A, так что, пожалуйста, задавайте свои вопросы в комментариях под постом трансляции или в чате в YouTube. Мы их соберем во время эфира, а также задавайте вопросы во время самой сессии. Лекция пройдет на английском языке с переводом на русский. Вы можете смотреть видео с русской дорожкой в русскоязычном Фейсбуке и ВКонтакте, и на английском на странице Стрелка Институт в Фейсбуке и на YouTube. Now, over to Professor Garcia.
Thank you very much, and welcome everybody. Thanks for tuning in wherever you are. As it's been introduced, today I'll be talking about architecture and containment, what I call stories of quarantine and isolation. But just before I start, I'd like to always describe quickly where I talk from. So I'm both have a degree in architecture, but also a degree in philosophy of art. But perhaps through my meandering story of teaching since 2002 and working in practice, an interesting shift happened in my architecture when I started the platform MAP. And I also started to develop a new approach to architecture as it has been mentioned in dealing with extreme environments. So today's lecture that will deal with quarantine and containment, in essence, starts from an experiment that I started in 2010, which was a series of publications which wanted to somehow throw outside of my practice the methodology that I was using to engage with architecture. Mainly the periphery, that is subjects that very seldom have to do with architecture, but also in a method, in an approach which was first about gathering information and then using that information to trigger speculative thoughts. As you can see here, this is a series of the publications that we had so far, but of course it was MAP Quarantine 002, which was a suggestion by a colleague, Jeff Manog, that triggered the first instances of dealing with architecture as a system of containment. And as you can see here, this map unfolds with the first page of facts and data and a second page in which then many of the questions arise from that data are then considered as architectural projects. So this is a departure point, but since then my experiences with containment, with diseases, with quarantine have expanded in many other areas. And in a way, this is what I will be presenting today. It will be a series of perceptions that will look at a system of containment from different points of view. And it's broken down into the following chapters, which is about revealing the invisible, literally the danger that we don't see, and what is it that we try to contain ourselves from. It always has that aspect of invisibility. The other one is about containing the unknown, or how have we dealt with that containment. The third one is beyond this world, because interestingly enough, the fear from outside, literally beyond our Earth sphere, has had quite an impact in how we deal with containment. And then the other one is dangers within, which is literally speculations that I've had also with my students with regards of containment within our own area of action. And lastly, I'd like to round off with a chapter that I call Automatically Contained, which is about technology and the boundless, or how technology and the loss of privacy are starting to impact intentions of health. So to start off, revealing the invisible. And this is quite interesting because there are many things that architecture contains. I feel that in essence, architecture in its most basic principles is about containing. It's actually about bracing and stopping some freedoms so others can be enhanced. It's about controlling temperature, controlling air and out, from inside and outside, controlling wind, but also controlling people and actions. Now that conditions, architecture actually has allowed us to do some preliminary protection against some diseases, for example. The following diagram that you see is literally a catalog of the diseases by name and by the International Classification Code by the WHO from 2009 that we cataloged in this fashion, literally making a distinction between those that are human, insects or mites, mollusks, nematodes, plants, and avian and mammal. And it's interesting also to point out that not all those diseases are necessarily quarantinable. That means that their impact on us is not as severe. If we look, on the other hand, at some of the most grave diseases that we've been surrounded by for some time, we can see that it's not necessarily coronavirus or similar. We only have had about 4 million coronaviruses so far and about 285,000 deaths as of yesterday. But on the other hand, we have about 300 million illnesses and more than 5 million deaths each year out of just tuberculosis, malaria, and AIDS. And that's not only to just contextualize ideas of severity, but also to make very clear that the idea of diseases has been with us from very, very early on in our history as humans, but also that it's very present today and its impact is very large. There's also a very, very interesting perspective on their morphology that we'll look at in a second, but also of their sources. So literally, if we look at where they come from, it's very often, these deadly diseases are around us in the most normal of elements, of domestic resources, from playgrounds to kitchen sinks to airplane bathrooms and ATM buttons. They're plagued with the footprints of our presences, and most of the time are not as severe as we might think, but many others literally just has deadly impacts. What's also interesting to look is that viruses themselves have their own containment systems. They have their own morphology. They have their own architecture. Here we see from Ebola worms all the way to coronavirus, how they are constructed differently. They invade the body in different manners. They also invade other cells and interrupt the DNA in very different complex strategies. And I think it's also interesting to reflect how they themselves are in conflict with containment and their own containment in how they engage and interact with us. Their sizes are also interesting. Here we have on the right-hand side a part per million. So this is literally the dust that and pollution elements are normally measured by scientific instruments. The PM10 is used as a standard. As you can see, is at 10 micrometers. And then we have a red blood cell. And on the other side of the spectrum, we have the coronavirus. And so the sizes are substantial, to say the least, even though we're talking about a microscopic level. And if we compare it here, how the PM10 compares with the section of a growing hair. Now, elements in the air have always been an interest for me. And I wanted to show this project some years ago, which was to try and detect and make the invisible visible. I constructed this cylinder with a rotating laser that I could turn on and then leave in space. And as particles would fly by, you would literally be able to see these elements illuminated. And I think it's an interesting reflection on the amount of elements that we're surrounded by daily and the amount of invisible elements. And these are just literally part per million. Imagine all the other smaller sizes. Comparable to this are projects of some of my students, for example, in Lanzhou, in Inner Mongolia, when they were trying to trap dust particles, micro dust particles. As you can see, Anders here with a catcher that was using morphologies and geometries of physical elements to precipitate some of the particles as he was moving through one of the most polluted cities in the world. And also in Lanzhou, in Inner Mongolia, Otis was trying to use spirulina as a way of filtering air and reducing the parts per million. It was interesting that this project were both very successful in filtering all of these micro pollutants. And the question, given the recent world events, is would spirulina also catch viruses? It would be interesting to kind of see what were the limit of, in a way, catching potential that some of these systems offer. On the other side of the spectrum, the invisible sometimes can also be large. And this project that I did also some years ago was about containing a very different type of invisible being. And it was tested in the islands of Svalbard, very close to the North Pole, between 70 and 80 degrees north. And this isolated archipelago, as you can see, has a very small settlement called Longyearbyen, with about 2,500 inhabitants. What's interesting is that they are surrounded, on the other hand, by over 3,000 polar bears. And they're a very present threat all year round. You cannot leave the settlement without a proper rifle or security, and they often are part of the challenges to be able to engage with the surroundings, and very often also attack and have suffered casualties of youths and visitors. But at the same time, they're very regulated, so you are not allowed to shoot regardlessly, and they're very well protected. So it was interesting to investigate how this community, especially when the winter nights happened, which is for several months, tried to engage with this, and then during that period of the year, invisible threat. One of them was to use architecture as a safety system. In this case, not to contain, but to offer the possibility of containment. That is, the doors of the private houses are mostly left open. So if some of the polar bears meander through town, as they often do, very quickly you can just take refuge in any given house. That also puts a question and makes a flip into our relationship to safety and security, where in a traditional urban context, you would close the doors for safety. You would close the doors for security. In this case, you leave them open because the threat from the outside is larger than the threat from the own community. And I think those are very interesting questions to reflect about how architecture can be binary at that level. My project specifically was a polar bear alarm, because interestingly enough, they do not have a perimeter that tries to navigate this edge condition between the wild and the settlement. So very often the bears would just suddenly appear and nobody would have seen them or heard of their approach. And the idea was to speculate on a system that could be placed in the periphery, that would be perceived by humans, and it would literally generate a boundary line, and that if crossed at some time, it would then trigger the alarm. There with my students in the middle of winter, and you are with your rifle. Even my language had to change. I could not say, because I was the one filming their work, I could not say I will shoot you at 9 or shoot you at 10. I had to change my language and say I will film you at 9, I will film you at 10. And very often a student would just suddenly come and touch me on the back and surprise me. And I was thinking, you know, if I have not seen you approach me, there was no way that I would also see a polar bear. So it's interesting how the idea of threat and containment can also take different scales, but it can also take different almost physical relationships. It can also become a way. So the idea of the dangerous landscape or the contaminated landscape is also very close to the idea of epidemic. In this case, this project was related to the Tohoku tsunami that happened in 2011. And we were there the year after to try to study the impacts on the landscape and specifically the explosion of the Fukushima Daiichi 2 plant. As you know, the explosion created a plume of radiation that both impacted the sea, but also many of the settlements and villages around the power plant. And the traces of radiation were relatively powerful and very present, making many landscapes quarantined and literally cordoned off. But the problem was that many of the houses were both impacted by radiation and the tsunami, and they had been lost of family members. And here we approach a very interesting aspect, which is the psychology of the individual, which we're going to be touching on quite a bit, and how the attachment to the social bond sometimes is so strong that even though those landscapes are cordoned off and very clearly marked in its periphery that one should not enter, individuals would almost on a weekly basis visit those lost landscapes, those lost in the houses, and make shrines to their lost ones, being exposed to high levels of radiation. It was this project that I took on board and tried to understand, could this be mediated differently? Could there be a different way of translating the invisible and the dangerous at another level that wasn't the abstraction of a sign? And I devised a radiation to sound translator, which would pick up radiation levels and created a soundtrack that was a reflection of ideas of severity, ideas of danger, playing with pitch, playing with rhythm, playing with speed. And we took this to different sites and placed these elements accordingly to try to have a type of understanding and relationship with the visitor when they were wanting to approach their sites or their loved ones. What was interesting about that experiment was that in some cases, the unknown soundtrack was the one that made them pause, that made them turn around. There was something that was not recognizable, even something as innocuous as a soundtrack in the landscape made them pause and turn around. And it was in itself more powerful than just a simple sign. In the next chapter, Containing the Unknown, or on contagions and physical ramifications, we'll see that the battle against pandemics is a very old one. In the publication, we made a timeline of key points throughout time where there had been great pandemics, and also key actions that were taken by different communities and nations of how to deal with the severity of those epidemics. From huge death tolls, for example, the Black Death in the 1300s claimed 450 million deaths, and in the early 1400s, it claimed 300 million deaths. We're talking something in the order of 25% of the population of all of Europe disappeared in those few years. But also something as relatively recent as the Spanish flu of 1918 claimed over 500 million deaths worldwide. But that was always linked to some type of action. It was always linked to some type of strategy. And there's some which are quite notable. For example, with regards to leprosy, there were some dictums already in the early 1300s, that not only segregated the lepers from a society like it had been done for many centuries, but also gave them the rights to design and build their own communities. And for the first time, they were given the possibility of creating new architectural typologies that were very well curated to their own needs. And that's quite a radical change. And just as radical was, for example, in the early 1300s, specifically in the 1374 in Dubrovnik, in the port time, the parameter into the spatial equation of a length of time one could be isolated. So the birth of quarantine was about 30 days in 1374 was an important one. Just as important was the fact that the vessel itself was used as the containment element. Now, this was very appropriate because it's already an autonomous architecture. It's a self-contained and self-subsisting element. So one could literally just put some barriers so it doesn't approach the harbor. And at the same time, the water itself creates that boundary condition. So there was this stigma very often on the floating ships that were left on a distance until those 30 days would pass, and the people in this ship would literally perish or would show to the authorities that they were alive. Now, this is obviously not new. We've met that idea of stigmatization of contained elements already in the past few weeks with cruise ships facing very similar conditions. The spread becomes isolated and contained, but at the same time, the container becomes the only element of assuring that it doesn't spread. There was another big shift that happened in architecture, which was in Venice in the 1400s, with the introduction of the Lazaretto. Now, for the first time, suddenly there was a specific tectonic response to the ship. It was an architecture that took the role of an eternal harbor ship, in essence, of a different scale. And this is where the sick would be shipped to, or the ships would dock towards, and the healthy, if there were any, would be allowed to leave after 40 days. It was also in this time period that the idea of 40 days was introduced, hence the word quarantine from quaranta in Italian or Latin. And it was both the birth of the typology of an isolation construct linked to time, and we can see very much in the architecture how the solutions of isolation also were internal. These wings that branched out were about isolation, about being able to communicate and supply with the minimum contact possible. And it had gardens and hospitals, and kind of supported itself in this autonomous manner, very much like the ships were doing before. And now throughout the time, from all the way from the 1300s to the present, all these different epidemics have allowed for different types of legislation and different types of typology to multiply and to be more curated. But perhaps one of the radical shifts that happened was in the late 1800s, also through the fear of tuberculosis as another epidemic. And the studies at the time and of using health as a way of regulating architectural design, but also, for example, urban design. So in the late 1800s, the Cerdà plan, which is the expansion of Barcelona, was mainly curated under those perspectives. We can see here the old medieval town in its density and less hierarchical distribution of functions, and the contrast with the orthogonal plan of the different carrés that distributed the expansion of Barcelona. And they were designed with air and sunlight in mind. Each unit had to have cross ventilation, had to have exposure to sunlight, and each of those carrés were literally defined in different morphologies and typologies with clear and open spaces in the interior. That obviously through time ended up becoming very luxurious real estate and be covered up. But also hospital typology and architecture radically changed, with wings very distant from each other and with high ceilings and light as one of the key conditions. So we see that through time, legislation was applied to architecture according to health conditions and threats that they were meeting. But it's not only in the physical sphere that the idea of quarantine has existed. Interestingly enough, we also know of a political quarantine in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. This created obviously huge tensions between the two nations of the Cold War at the time and Cuba. And there was a fragile ping pong of actions and diplomacy. Both nations were very acute and very aware that both words and actions had to be taken very lightly. And what's interesting is that, politically speaking, a naval blockade is actually a declaration of war. So you cannot do a blockade around Cuba or another nation without actually being a declaration of war. So the word quarantine was used as a way of defining the same intention, but without the same, I would say, legislative implications. So according to the Oxford English Dictionary, the quarantine, or a political quarantine, can be defined as the severance of diplomatic relations, blockade or boycott imposed on a nation in order to isolate it, but at the same time without being a declaration of war. So it's interesting how the idea of quarantine has this dimension of the political sphere, also as a way of containing, but of avoiding conflict. Just as interesting and very close to that time was the fear of alien contagions and its physical ramifications. So at the time, the political and polarization of the Cold War also manifested itself in the Western world as this invention of the sci-fi invasion from afar. This paranoia of the danger beyond was obviously part of the psyche of the Western inhabitants at the time, and it was capitalized by much of the literature and the sci-fi of that epoch. But it wasn't without some type of a real consideration. So we all know and recognize this image of Sputnik, the first satellite ever launched in 1957, but we recognize much less this image. This is a rocket of the Corona, which was a photography spy satellite from 1959. What's interesting about this is it was the first element or construct that we sent out into orbit and was captured on its way down. Every other artifact that would send into orbit until then had then slowly is what's defined as any element that comes from orbit into Earth and might contaminate the Earth. And it's strictly set in a series of protocols. So we have a first example at the time of the paranoia of things that might come from abroad, which curiously enough, in this case, comes from the same nation that felt a threat from the outside. But just as interesting is what's called forward contamination, or the contamination that we might cause onto other bodies beyond the Earth. And the first one to happen was literally also in 1959, the Lunar 2 Soviet probe, which crashed onto the lunar surface, but at the same time left some remnants of the aspects or even perhaps the potential possibility of forward contamination of both viruses and other microbacteria that is now being shown to be able to survive in extreme conditions. So this artifact perhaps was one of the first ever left on the moon, which was difficult to know if it survived or not. But we do know that since then, about 179 artifacts have left our Earth towards other planets and moons. And to try and curate this, it's interesting that albeit the polarization and the tensions that existed at the time, in 1967, the US and the USSR and the UK ratified the United Nations Outer Space Treaty. In other words, the legal basis for planetary protection, which led to the extraterrestrial exposure law of 1969, also ratified by the nations that were sending probes out into space, and with very curious violation systems. So literally whoever willfully violates and attempts to violate these clauses, and I jump to the end, will be fined more than $3,000 or imprisoned for not more than 1 year. it's interesting that we already had enforcement elements for the violation of containment of something that is so far-fetched as contaminants from far beyond the Earth's orbit. And it's almost kind of ironic because this legislation has existed for a very long time in other types of conditions, and obviously we also experience it in many nations today. But it did lead to sterilization processes and systems of containment, and this is important now, that suddenly ended up falling on how we contained epidemic agents in the Earth today. So during the 1969 Apollo crew arrival, you can see them leaving the Apollo capsule after landing in the Pacific Ocean with hazmat suits and filter systems developed actually for biological warfare. So suddenly the containment for biological warfare is used for containing something that has to do with an element of the unknown from beyond the Earth's orbit. They were literally isolated and carried out into what's called the Hornet 3. And this is even more ironic because what they used for their isolation unit, the architecture that represented the containment of potential danger from abroad, was literally an airstream. One of the most acute representations of American freedom of the time was used to represent containment and isolation for the 3 astronauts. This unit was then literally carried and flown over to another piece of architecture, which was a kind of a first. Here we see the sequence of isolation and quarantine for the returning astronauts, but their last place of rest, if you could call it, was the Lunar Receiving Laboratory. This building was designed strategically and with the sole purpose of receiving the lunar samples and the lunar astronauts. And because it had to do so, the series of containments and frontier edge conditions had to be highly curated. And a series of protocols was introduced into how you could go from one zone to the other, from the most high-risk contamination areas all the way to the entrance and reception. And this allowed a formalization and the naming of the astronauts had to literally appliances and decor, such as almost 18th century wooden, side beds and lamps. And I think this contrast represents very well the idea of the psyche, that you had to have something recognizable when you are in quarantine, even though the room is as sterile and as isolated as one could imagine. And I often wonder if Stanley Kubrick, who did the film just slightly before the landing on the moon, was inspired by some of these images or had access to them in his literally last sequences where the astronaut was also in isolation. But of course, we have a danger within the confinements of the Earth. And it's here that many of the solutions developed for the NASA returning astronauts started to feed into strategies and protocols of containing agents in Earth. First, they were almost devised towards biological war, but very quickly also defined how we should engage with virus agents. And they're the biosafety levels. So biosafety levels are categorized from 1 to 4, and in a way they define different protocols according to how severe the contagions are and how not only deadly but also easy to transmit, or the systems that we might have to be able to treat them via vaccines or similar. And of course, safety level 4 is the highest. We have examples of Ebola and smallpox virus as being the ones that are studied and contained under those conditions. And there aren't that many of these labs across the world, and they're very much in the northern hemisphere, very often very separate from the regions where today we see some epidemics bloom. And we've seen that recently how we've had to construct almost instant containment systems with bio-level safety for frontiers and sluice systems to be able to allow a clean access. Here is literally a representation of the architecture and processes that take part, and all the way before you're even able to start to carry out your job in the laboratory. So both from cleaning and rinsing and protocols of containment with regards to the clothes and disinfection of the clothes, to the air conditioning systems and backups. And literally at the end, you are, in a way, a containment element within a polluted condition. These types of elements also allowed us to reflect and speculate on projects, for example, like the Zoo of Contagious Species. I mean, I allowed myself to imagine what would happen if there was a zoo where we just put together both the microscopic and the large contagions that we have on Earth and allowed them to thrive, to give them their own sanctuary. And as a site, I chose the Trinity site, which is already a quarantine site. It's the site of the first nuclear explosion in Nevada. And under this kind of concrete dome, you would find a sluice and an entrance that follow those BSL systems, and then allowed you to come into this construct, this zoo of death that was allowed to thrive. And if you were to have to treat, work, or experiment in some of these agents, you would literally take an elevator to this deep core isolated space where those experiments or studies could be taken into account and carried out. But you could see that the idea was to create almost this fascination of destruction, which in essence, in a smaller scale, we could always argue that this already happens in labs that are dealing with biological warfare or even with some virus manipulation, in which in a petri dish, you already have a representation of what I'm speculating here, which is this cosmos of explosion, of eventual uncontrolled evolution of contagions. Further in the speculating aspect, I ventured into a more domestic area, which is the production of food, specifically a farm for beef, reflecting on the problems of the 90s in the UK with the mad cow disease, which meant there was about 400,000 cattle infected and several 100,000 people infected by the same virus. In a way, it was a critique to the bucolic and romantic idea of the cows being everywhere in an open landscape, which in case of a scenario of a breakout, of a containment by a curtain that would unfold and unroll around the system. And these elements would populate a landscape almost as this pristine modernist constructions, giving the cows the same kind of Corbusian ideal of modernism, the fallacy of a security, in essence, or of a better life. Because at the end of the day, in case of an emergency, quick eradication and clean systems would have to be taken into motion, and an eternal moat of disinfectant would be the only protecting element. And of course, this is a kind of a tongue-in-cheek project, but also wants to reflect on our faith on the technological potential of resolving threats in the size and impact of that epidemics have. They're very often very out of our control, and it doesn't matter how technologically advanced or modernist, positivist orientated we might be. It's really our own behavior that is very often at the core or even at the source of the problem. And going back to our own behavior, I would like to reflect on quarantine and madness as a domestic challenge. So we've all felt it slightly during these past weeks, the idea of the strain of isolation, of being indoors, some nations in a harsher way than others. But the idea of isolating yourself from the importance of social structure and network that we have in our everyday life has incredible impact in our psyche. Very often the spaces that we are constrained or isolated in are very small. In this case, it's an improvised one. Sometimes it's a room that is fully contained. But it's also interesting to reflect that you are considered, when you are isolated, if you have an agent, a viral agent, which is deadly, and you're instantly quarantined, you're considered, first of all, also a danger to your own self. And that is why your belt, your comb, your pens and pencils are removed from you, because the psychological pressure of isolation can be so harsh that you might be pushed to the edge of sanity and perhaps commit suicide or aggravate other members that are trying to help you, which is a very interesting reflection, how that isolation, first of all, considers you a threat, not only to everybody else, but also to yourself. The pressure is also, of course, on the visitors. So the people that come and visit you, if they have that chance at all, are suddenly within time slots, very short times, and with gear that very seldom allow you to humanize that contact. Sometimes it might even happen through systems that are remote. But in essence, we've also experienced these days how not even architecture allows the flexibility to be able to say goodbye to your loved ones if they're literally about to die from a virus. Now, it is that psychological pressure that I wanted to reflect on when I did this project, which is a domestic isolation unit. What would happen if the isolation was brought home instead of the contaminated individual isolated in a hospital? So this project tries to speculate on this portable system that inflates around you and allows you to, in the first instances, carry out the basic aspects that you need on your everyday life, but at least close to your loved ones. The food could be brought to you, elongated gloves could allow you to hug. Interestingly is the zipper. You can see a zipper in the middle of this bubble. And this is was an important element in this design, because this zipper allows this containment to be burst if both individuals open the zipper at the same time. And this is because it's been documented and very often that family members will choose to be contaminated and risk their lives, but they prefer to do so as long as they can be with their loved ones. And that is, psychologically speaking, an area of study which is obviously very powerful in understanding our relationship to danger, our relationship to the indivisible danger, and also our relationship to our loved ones or family members. On another scale and another reflection of an element through time, the containment of the ship was here a study on the eternally quarantined. So it's interesting to reflect that through space and time, we've accumulated elements, historical elements, which are polluted. Sometimes they radiated, sometimes they are politically censored, sometimes they're contagious with polio, which can last several months. So this ship is now, the idea of the ship as a quarantine element is turning its head and becoming this eternal quarantine of quarantined artifacts from books and libraries that have been not accessible because of the pollutants. They would eternally navigate through harbors, stay at a distance, and be isolated and have their own biosafety level to allow access for researchers. It would also be the place where secrets perhaps would be kept and even revealed in this spaces of solace. On a much more realistic aspect, this project by a student of ours in our trip and study to the Amazon reflects on a very different type of danger. In our travels to the Amazon, throughout a month stay in an isolated region, and tributary, Gabriele studied malaria as the vector that invades many regions of the world and kills over 2 million people every year. And the way that we use to contain it is very often through the mosquito net, but it also creates problems of ventilation. So she tried to curate different levels of density of mosquito netting and trying to mediate the contact between herself and the vector, the malaria carrying mosquito. And in this project, then she started to measure ideas of temperature difference and wind permutation or permanence through the structure to try and isolate, is there a middle way between comfort and isolation? And this also ended up in a project that allowed a clinic in an otherwise quite isolated region to navigate through the Amazon, not only allowing for containment, but also an architecture that was both physical and net and malleable, elastic, if one would say, to be able to contain individuals and isolate them in larger spaces to give them some solace from their traditional habitation. So it was both a place of solitary confinement for the infected, treatment, mediation and education, but also of leisure as it travels throughout the Amazon. The idea of the mosquito net, of course, is not new. The Gates or Melinda Gates Foundation has been trying to fight malaria for many, many years now. And they've given away millions and millions, about 22 million mosquito nets to different regions of the world. The mosquito nets are very interesting. They're called LLINs, or long-lasting insecticidal nets. They're nets which are filled with insecticide, which helps obviously repel the mosquito, the malaria mosquito. But at the same time, it's interesting to reflect that if you try to sleep inside one of these mosquito nets in the tropics, you suffocate. It's almost impossible to breathe. And that distancing between reality and context is very often reflected in how architects and designers are detached from a site or even a specific problem. It is obvious that many of these individuals do not end up sleeping in these mosquito nets and end up using them as fishing nets, killing the ecosystem and diluting the insecticides and catching fish that are polluted with the insecticide. And this kind of distancing between reality and solution is something that very often happens when we have knee-jerk reactions to containment. When we want to contain something very quickly, we just promote it without the thorough investigations of what are the ramifications and the impacts beyond the immediately obvious. These problematics have been picked up by media, but perhaps more importantly by one of my colleagues, Jakob Knudsen, an architect who, through his work in Tanzania and with our students lately, has been reflecting on how to consider the house itself, the architecture itself, as the containment. That would allow for a greater volume of air, would allow for a greater temperature comfort, and a new definition of the domestic aspect of a space and containing that whole space instead of the very few square meters of a bed. And it has allowed him in work with many large foundations create prototypes of these housing where the walls disappear, the walls become a netting on their own at different degrees of airflow and for different activities, creating a bottom and an above, which is more prone to the breeze. And different levels of permeability allow for comfort and literally for better control of the mosquitoes. So here again, architecture takes on a role that otherwise was delegated to medicine and delegated to maybe even products aimed for personal protection. But suddenly the idea of scale and domestic ritual, if understood as a whole and understood as within the realm of architecture, there's very different areas of exploration that opens up to. As a final reflection, I wanted to touch on what I call the automatically contained, or where control goes digital. I think the idea of technology and automation are playing a radical new facet in the history of containment and epidemics. Not only size and engineering feats, as literally being able to disinfect whole streets just by a truck driving by, and the amount of sheer scale that we can then promote actions, that has been known for a long time. What's interesting is how now we're using automated systems to distance ourselves and diffuse these elements through our society in an effort to automatize ideas of disinfection. And these robots, meanderization has always, again, been thought of a way of distancing the long arm, the protecting, literally disinfect surfaces. Others disinfect aerosols or use aerosols to disinfect halls. Unity Drive is literally using these modules to deliver post in an automated manner. And of course, the role of the drone has suddenly exploded and has been granted a license rarely had before to survey and control, for example, in this case, distancing, social distancing, not only to charter and curate it, but also to literally advise live towards the inhabitants. Other elements are of automated robots that have been tested in Singapore, which go through the parks and again disperse individual. And it's interesting here is how even the idea of diagnose and looking at our own ritual of how we might or might not sneeze or what our body temperature might be are starting to be tested as a way of controlling the disease. In the name of general health, individuals are stamped with the entry dates and quarantined, and if seen, they should be arrested and then brought back into their confinement. And just as importantly is the spread of apps that have been now already introduced that allow you literally to surrender your every moment, your every contact with other individuals in a way of systematizing a landscape of contagions and contaminated individuals. In essence, we relinquish that liberty, and it's taking over almost the role that architecture has had for a very long time. Suddenly, you're not mediated through the physical constraints of walls, but through the dictation of directions or areas of permanence or movement that might be signaled to you through a larger ecosystem of interactive social applications. And I think that evolution between a physical constraint and something that's suddenly starting to take over as a digital constraint is also a really interesting one that plays within the realms of boundaries, in this case as digital ones and not only as physical ones. Most of these aspects or directions are being done as experiments, but what's interesting is that until a vaccine is found, architecture is still the only cure. Strangely enough, the archaic physical walls that have existed for millennia are, until further notice, the only constraints that allow us to protect ourselves from one another in case of a pandemic. And I think that's a very interesting reflection on architecture and the problems that it can generate, but also the solutions that it can offer. With that, I kind of wanted to end this lecture and open up for questions. But I would like to round off that the ideas of containment that I tried to show are both of speculative and a critique to many of the solutions that have happened through time, but also open up the floodgates to understand that this has been an ongoing relationship that the architecture has had to epidemic waves and the unknown danger of both viral or otherwise. And that in essence, it's going to be interesting to see how after experiencing this in the 21st century, our reflection of what the domestic space might be challenged. And I think those are interesting considerations for future designers. when we design future housing, do we have to then take it into account that it also has to be our eventual workspace, gym, discotheque, microbar, school for our children? And I think those reflections haven't really been taken on board when we have designed the domestic space. And this might be a very interesting area of reflection. Thank you very much for your time. This is my lecture for today, and I suppose we'll open up for some questions now.
David, thank you so much for such a comprehensive lecture. Yes, we have a bunch of questions. Our first question is about city planning. Do you think the pandemic will make city authorities and urban planners to rethink the way cities should be planned and accelerate the development of the 15-minute city concept? Have you heard of that?
Yeah.
Paris, Melbourne, 20-minute neighborhood.
I think we've all experienced this, but I remember in the first week or so, or here in Denmark, when social distancing was introduced in a supermarket, well, in any public space, supermarkets were still open. I remember suddenly meandering and being very conscious, obviously, of the people around me, and then suddenly stopping, and then in a ricochet manner, the whole supermarket stops because everybody was stopping about 2 meters from each other. And I thought it was a fantastic reflection on the agility and the speed that the individual has in reacting spatially to a construct. A simple set of rules is introduced, and the very quick reaction is manifested. Suddenly, the supermarket realized that the shelves were maybe too close to each other, and very quickly they were realigned. But I think it's the power of the space of the outside. The public space is many more pandemics I think will come, but they might be very different in how they behave and how they react. And I think I'd be wary of dictating.
If you argue that surveillance is an important tool in tracking and mitigating the virus, metaphorical virus or not, where is the line between panoptic governance and just, let's say, governance for the greater good?
Yeah, that is.
I suppose it's a moral implications question.
Yeah, I mean that is what I tried to reflect upon. I think where is the boundary between sacrificing your own liberties and rights for the greater good, and that is a very difficult one. And we've experienced that throughout history in different forms and shapes. I think it's often not so much the solution, but the owner of the solution that can be a problem. So that instigation, what is the backup plan? What is the rollback plan of a legislation that suddenly might endanger some of our freedoms? And I think very often legislations are set in motion, but we don't hear how they might be unrolled and what are the implications, or what are their length, or how would they be checked, or who is cross-referencing. We're just looking at the direct impact and effect of a solution. One might adhere to it or not morally, but there's very seldom a reflection on how that is supported, so that it still has some reflection on the national statute of laws, for example.
Yeah, can be predicted, really. Next question. What could be done to make isolation spaces better from a design point of view in hospitals and at home, except of the amazing bubble you had in your presentation?
Yeah. I think I think that's an interesting one. I think in the essays and articles and interviews that I've read, what I can reflect upon is not so much the need from the healthcare. From their perspective, they need more attire and more isolation units. So it's literally a necessity of scale. It's not that there's anything wrong with their present isolation units, but they would need to have many more in case of an emergency. So there's nothing wrong with the PPEs that they're using, but they just need more of them. But what is lacking apparently, and this comes both from healthcare and from society is the possibility of literally being able to be relatively close to individuals who are about to pass, who are about to die. And there's no contingency plan for that. There's seldom a design that allows you to be as close to somebody who's about to pass away while both being protected. And that is a design problem. That is a design challenge. It's absolutely possible through the world of architecture and design, and that could be an important one for literally the psyche and social well-being when we have to say goodbye to people due to an epidemic.
But there is an opinion that modernist architecture appeared as a reaction to tuberculosis. How could you comment on this, taking into account your answer that you just gave out?
I think that at least the modernist and positive movement and the relationship that we had with science at the time was absolutely one which was a positive. So typologies like the sanitariums for tuberculosis, and we have great, it was a great typology for modernist architects because they could argue for an analytical and functionally orientated typology that really didn't have a history or didn't really have a very big history. So those types of typologies were very quickly appropriated by the modernist architect because there wasn't an aesthetical tradition. It wasn't an aesthetic that they had to rebel or fight against. It was almost like a tabula rasa of taking a problem, a challenge, trying to be very matter of fact and functionally orientated. And I think both hospitals and sanitation, even the bathroom, the tiles within the corners weren't necessarily an invention of the modernists, but they were absolutely absorbed and embraced by them. So I think that there is a link between the idea of health and cleanness. Also, much of the rhetoric in modernism is about a healthier and better life, right? And even using anachronical and ancient, 18th century narratives as well, good ventilation and solar exposure. These were not inventions by Corbusier for housing complexes. These were already a heritage of health legislations and orientations from the 1800s. So I think there's absolutely a link, not only in a bloom of typology that they appropriated, but also in a methodology, in an approach to there's a problem, there's a disease, a logical approach and a functional approach can solve it. Obviously, hopefully, we're very much more critical to those approaches today.
Do you think that some measures that make epidemic isolation easier and less scary for people, at the same time, like less responsible measures?
I don't know if I understand that.
Maybe like you don't lock people inside or at the apartments like for 40 days, which quarantine previously was like, but make it less strict, but at the same time it's less responsible, but it's easier for people to follow those rules.
Easier to, I don't know if there's a way of making it easier to follow the rules. I think humans are amazing at collaborating, but also of breaking their own rules just as quickly. And hence why some nations have implemented very strict rules. You're not allowed to leave your apartment unless you are going to shop or purchase medicine. In Denmark, it has been much more relaxed. But you see, even here in Denmark, police giving huge fines to youth that have decided to party in the park. I think the balance and the tension between being told what to do and doing something for the greater good, it's always going to be what defines us as humans and as a social construct. How to make that easier might be to literally work with systems of flow in time. So perhaps parks have different shifts. Perhaps that this has been done also with streets with different directions, which is much easier to keep a distance. So I think there's the possibility of introducing behavior patterns or behavior suggestions that can allow us to move away from the constraints of our own apartment. And I think I think it's the hardest, but I think it's the most flexible, as I mentioned before, which can allow for the individuals to still be outside and even carry out some functions, normal functions, while still being under a quarantine condition. But of course, history also proves that we are also the first ones to break the rule, and it only takes one.
True. One of our viewers assumed that the idea of expanding spaces to ensure social distance will cause a conflict between the owners of buildings and other spaces. How do you think we can solve this problem? And could you please reflect on that?
Between the owners of buildings and?
Between owners of the buildings and people walking on the street, because you taking up the space which can be used for restaurant, for tables from restaurant and cafes, and now you just make a pavement bigger to keep social distancing.
Yeah. What I think about that?
Yeah. What do you think about this potential conflict?
Well, there is absolutely conflict, and I think I think the idea of commerce or economy will always be in conflict with obviously ideas of general health and lockdown, and this was very relevant already in the 1300s, when you would have some ships arriving and literally hiding the sick individuals in areas of the ship so they were not detected. Or those that were dying inside the ship were slowly discarded at night and sunk into the bottom. So what I'm trying to say is that the idea of commerce is an important one, because the ships wanted to deliver their goods before they would rot, etc. And that's also what we see today. We see how the US has some internal conflict. The world still more or less functioning, and you start to reflect on which functions might be superfluous and which might be necessary. But of course, for the restaurant owner, his restaurant is always necessary. It's his source of income. I have no answer about that. I still think, on the other hand, that you can still have a wide sidewalk that suddenly narrows, not only because there's restaurant tables, but because there's many other things and people take turns in going by. And there might be a bottleneck, but those exist also in our everyday lives without the conditions that we've experienced lately. I think humans have that incredible power of navigating in one direction or the other, a positive or a negative one, when there's a conflict of masses. And I would just literally put much more effort in how we literally as a society can adopt new ways of behavior. And we have those already. Many of the things that we do in our everyday lives weren't normal 50 years ago or maybe even 25 years ago. But now we accept them and we're able to navigate around them because we've changed the way that we react to that challenge.
Are you going to change your master program in the light of the
isolation and containment, but also dealing with it in context of an island, an archipelago. So both isolation as a territory, but also isolation within a smaller scale, and reflecting on ideas of pandemic and the insular. So yes, it's impacted us.
Like all of us.
Yeah.
Some people from our audience ask where we can find your design projects, which you showed here today.
Yes, the publication. So some of the projects are from our master program, and for the past 5 years, we filmed the first semester, which is when they do the prototype testing, design and test and field work. So you can find most of the student projects in our YouTube channel. If you just write architecture and extreme environments in YouTube, you will see a channel which is broken down into Arctic edition of quarantine and updated slightly given the present situation. But that might take a while given the present conditions. But that would be a good place to look out for the new quarantine. Otherwise, the other ones are available, I think.
Are you planning a book maybe on those maps?
Yes, there is going to be a book about not only the publication, but my work in general. So literally the methodology that I use, both as a speculation, but also many of the projects that I do and test as in the extreme scenarios, which are habitats, small habitats that I test different types, aiming towards autonomous habitats. And also a lot of the pedagogy strategies and areas of research that we've done at KDK with the students. So that's a book which is in the process. Hopefully by the end of the year, that will be published.
Okay, well, good luck with the book.
Thank you.
And I think we have a last question. We will soon be out of quarantine. How likely are architects and environmentalists to resist going back to business as usual?
I think architects will go back to business as usual as quickly as they can, because their livelihood depends on it. And I think we're also opportunists. So I think we'll try and capitalize on these challenges to offer ourselves again as saviors as we keep doing through time. I don't think we have all the answers at all, but it is an important area to revisit and consider, at least. I think environmentalists, I don't know what they will do. I'm sure they will have a lot to say, given what we have stopped doing to the planet, because we've been more at home. That's had an impact in our environment, which has been very obvious. There's already many voices saying that perhaps we should just continue the status quo if we want to break the environmental impact that otherwise we're having in the world. That's a discourse that's out there. So I can't talk for them, but I know from colleagues here and in other nations that are very eager to revisit many of our aspects of our practice under these conditions. And I know that I'll be taking part in some research projects which will try to look at our house, our habitation, our as perhaps a space that can accommodate when different members have to suddenly isolate and carry out our everyday lives, but from within.
Well, I think it's time to wrap it up. Thank you so much for being with us today on this nice Tuesday. Do you want to say bye?
Yes. I want to say thank you to Strelka for the invitation and for everybody involved, technically and editorially, to make this happen, and to everybody that came today. Hopefully also across the world. Thank you very much for your time and your attention. It's been brilliant. I hope I could see everybody's faces, which is what one likes when one gives lecture. But yeah, I guess I'll see the number of people who've seen this. Thank you very much for everything.
Thank you to all our audience who've been with us tonight. You can access the video record afterwards on Strelka Institute YouTube. Also, keep your eyes on our social media and strelka.com for next events. Thank you and bye-bye.